Okay, so part of what we like to do, as we said, is land people and land people well. So this is essentially a panel that looks at Korea. This is a panel that essentially is looking at Korea, and it's titled Korea's Pivotal Role in the World, Challenges and Opportunities in Leadership. So this ties in very much with our themes. We have our 4 themes for IAFOR over the year. Humanity and human intelligence, technology and artificial intelligence, peace, education and global citizenship, and leadership. So this is a panel, I think, that ties into this, and I hope will also tie into the forum coming. So I've already given the introduction in terms of reading out bios, but I'd like our panelists to introduce themselves in 2 minutes or less. And Jim, we'll start with you.
Okay, thank you. And thank all of you for being here this morning. In 2 minutes, well,
I'll not now. 1 minute 45, Jim.
Okay, 1:45. You got it. I came to Korea as a 23-year-old Peace Corps volunteer and taught English at Kangwon National University in 1971-72. 15 years later, I returned as a senior Fulbright scholar at Yonsei University in 1985-86. And in 1986, Korea was still under a military government. A lot of student demonstrations at Yonsei, which is right next door to Ewha. And so we were talking about that just before the panel. In 1996, I came back to Korea full-time to work with Fulbright Commission, where I spent 14 years. And since then I left and have taught, as was mentioned in the introduction, at KAIST. And for the last 10 years here on the Incheon Global Campus at SUNY Korea. So that's a little bit
Perfect
of my background and my interests. My PhD is in communication, and I'm a little new to the Middle States and niche diplomacy area with Professor Howe's expertise, but I am a communication scholar, so that's very multidisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, so I'm comfortable with this IAFOR approach.
Thank you. Thanks, Jim. Brendan, self-introduction for yourself.
All right, thanks, Joe. It's great to be here. I've been in Korea for 23 years. I never thought I'd be here for 23 years. I thought I'd come for a year or two. But I think what sums up my experience in Korea is one of the old mottos of Korea, which is dynamic Korea. And I really do feel that what's kept me here so long is the willingness of Korean society to embrace change, despite the fact it's also known as the Neo-Confucian society, which is supposed to be very resistant to change. And here we are in the new city of Songdo, which I think really epitomizes this attitude that when Korean society sets its collective mind to do something, they will do it. And whether that be the miracle on the Han River, which is the economic miracle, or whether that will be the political miracle to transition to democracy and then sustain that democracy. The real can-do spirit of Korea, I think, is what has encouraged me to embrace this as my home. And my experience when I first came to Korea, there were lots of challenges. There are still some challenges that the world encounters in Korea. Today we're talking about what Korea faces in the world, but they're getting better. And once it's brought to someone's attention that something needs to be done, it's done. So foreign faculty used to be seriously discriminated against, no longer the case. So my experience in Korea has also led me to embrace the the future for Korea. So that's what we're going to be talking about today.
Thank you, Brendan. Okay, so the outline of this panel, and there's just a couple of paragraphs that I'm going to read here in the form of an introduction, and that is so as the global political landscape is becoming increasingly polarized, and the global community battles natural, humanitarian, and social crises, the world is turning towards a new kind of multilateral cooperation and leadership. Middle powers are repositioning themselves to become pivot states, states that stand in between superpowers and are desired as allies due to their military, economic, technological, or intellectual advantage. South Korea is one of those middle powers, with a great window of opportunity to advance through its niche diplomacy, and we'll discuss what that means in a bit, and become an influential pivot state while addressing pressing global issues. While South Korea is leading, and leading well, in certain areas it also faces significant challenges that may jeopardize its leadership potential. So in this panel here, we're going to center around 4 questions. And those questions are, what kind of leadership do we need today? In which areas does Korea lead well? What challenges is Korea facing that may jeopardize its leadership position? And despite these challenges, how does Korea stay competitive? So we'll start with the leadership. And Jim, you've got between 3 and 5 minutes on this. So what kind of leadership do we need today?
Okay, thank you. During my time in Korea, I've met a lot of friends. At Yonsei University, when I was there, all of the faculty in the Department of Mass Communication, but also they were, one of my colleagues, Park Kung-soo, was the founding dean of the Graduate School of International Studies there, and Yonsei was a leader in Korea. Now all the leading universities have such schools. So I've had the privilege, actually, it was when I was teaching at the University of Washington before relocating back to Korea. One of my Yonsei colleagues came on a Fulbright grant to the United States, and we were having dinner one evening at the faculty club at the University of Washington. And he said to me, "Jim, there's someone in Korea that you need to meet." That person was Dr. Oh Myung, and I was introduced to him when he was chairman of the Daejeon Expo. Following the success of the Seoul Olympics in 1988, Korea hosted a specialized international exposition in Daejeon, which attracted large audiences, mostly domestic, but it had the participation of 120 or so countries. And anyway, Dr. Oh Myung now is widely regarded as the godfather of Korea's ICT sector and its digital development. So I was introduced by my Yonsei colleague, Chae Jung-ho, to Oh Myung, and that was the start of my own research focus on digital development in Korea. When I started back in the early 90s, we weren't talking so much broadly about digital development, but with 2020 hindsight, it's now clear that starting in the mid 20th century, the world embarked on this great transition from an industrial mass media economy to a network information society. There's been a lot of scholarship on this. I like to focus on, I like to call it the digital network revolution. Manuel Castells prefers the network society. I've been influenced by work, Yochai Benkler's book, for example, The Wealth of Networks. There were three things that went on back in the 20th century. The invention of the transistor in the year I was born. The following year, Claude Shannon's mathematical theory of communication was published. And this led to allowed engineers to develop over time a completely digital switching systems and to install them into the telephone networks. These three developments, the transistor, the mathematical theory of communication, and then digital switching, led to exponential growth in the human capacity to store, compute, and communicate information. I've lived in Korea off and on in such a way that I tell people I have one foot firmly planted in the 20th century, another one now here in the 21st century. And so my own research focuses on questions of why, how, when did Korea begin to experience this important digital development. It is, I think, the body of scholarship and observation by policymakers and journalists around the world would support the notion that Korea is one of the, probably the single example of a most successful transfer from being a poor developing nation to an advanced economy. And this was
and that happened
this happened beginning in the 1980s and developing on into the 90s and continues to this day.
So basically, this Korea is one of these countries that had a very, very fast development in the post-war period.
Yes.
So the question, Jim, is what kind of leadership do we need today?
And the answer to that question is that I think the Korean example would suggest is technocratic leadership. That is, government, industry, and academic leaders who are technically trained to deal with this digital development.
Right.
Yeah. And Korea had it, and actually, following the assassination of Park Chung-hee, President Park, in the fall of 1979, this is when politically South Korea was in a terrible shape. Economically, the GDP growth rate went into negative territory, and there was the old Ministry of Communication, the Chaeshinbu, could not supply basic telephone service to average Korean citizens. So into this arena stepped two technocrats in particular, Dr. Kim Jae-ik, who was the chief economic advisor to President Chun Doo-hwan, and then Dr. Oh Myung came to work with him at the Blue House.
So it's this technocratic leadership that was also combined with essentially the beginnings of organized business. Correct?
Yes, and so to be even more specific, during the 1980s, Dr. Oh was dispatched to the Ministry of Communications, the old Chaeshinbu, to be the youngest ever vice minister. He had recently finished a PhD in electrical engineering at Stony Brook University, so that's the technocrat side.
Okay.
Kim Jae-ik, who invited him to the Blue House, was a Stanford-trained economist, but Kim had visited Taiwan and seen the importance of electronic switching. So Korea went in the 1980s from a telephone backlog to being internationally competitive in semiconductors, to building and installing its own and exporting its TDX digital switch, and
that was part of a very, very fast development and into to the Korea that we see and know today.
Yes.
Jim, I'm going to pass it over to Brendan.
Okay.
The question is, what kind of leadership do we need today? So Jim, I think, gave great context in the type of leadership that was required, which was similar to the Japanese model, in this collaboration between close collaboration, one might argue corruption, but between the state and big business.
Yeah, I think that what Korea has done very well is educating the next generation of leaders. And they've identified what is needed at each step of that process. So they've transitioned from a developing country into a developed country and now a major donor of international aid. And they've exported this model as well, this development through education. And I think what this question is getting at now is, what is the next step of leadership? That, yes, it's great that we've created this technocratic society that has led to tremendous economic growth. But what are we going to need going forward? And I think one of the challenges, actually as alluded to by Joe just then, that this focus on state development, on state security, in collaboration or cahoots with big business, has a downside. And that downside is the negative impact on individual security, human security, the security of the most vulnerable, but also the negative impact on the wider global stage, the global biosphere. And these are areas where Korea is also starting to turn its attention. We have the Global Green Growth Institute right here, which is a UN body, but set up by Korea and mostly still funded by Korea, to examine the impact that we're having in the Anthropocene era. Korea has also been quite active in promoting human security, although they don't use that term because the Japanese were closely associated with human security promotion. But a lot of Korean development assistance does focus on human-centered areas. But I think we need more of that. Now, Jim referenced the Graduate School of International Studies at Yonsei. It was one of 9 graduate schools, excuse me, set up at the same time by the Korean government for the purpose of internationalizing education in Korea to produce this next generation of leaders. And I'd just like to add that actually Ewha Women's University is ranked #1 of these graduate schools of international studies. So with one thing we can score over Yonsei. And I think they perform a very valuable function in this next step, that we need to move away from this parochial nationalism. It's not going to be enough to just be a national leader. You've got to look at the contributions, both positive and negative, that your nation makes globally. So we need global leaders for the next generation. We need to educate a global awareness. And this is what worries me about the current geopolitical situation, is that we're moving back towards parochialism. And it's very problematic that we can only deal with the challenges we face globally if we have a much more international and global mindset. At Ewha Women's University, we're now nearly 80% international students. When I first arrived at Ewha GSIS, we were about 5 or 10% international students. Our faculty, we're about 50% international faculty now at Ewha GSIS. So I think this is the way forward, that Korean society needs to internationalize, Korean education needs to internationalize, but also the same is true for everybody else. We need more global awareness, but also more focus on the negative impact of development on the most vulnerable individuals and groups.
Thank you, Brendan. So we're going to move on to the second question. We've already, I think, tapped some of this, but in which areas does Korea lead well? So I have two people here who are a long time sort of Korea residents, inhabitants. I've spent probably a total of 3 days in Korea in my life. So I'm coming at this from somebody who doesn't really know very much about Korea, aside from what I've heard, what I've read, and what I've seen from the outside. So in which areas does Korea lead well? So I'm going to say from the outside perspective, I've heard of such names as Samsung and Hyundai. So that's a similar thing perhaps from those people who are outside Japan have heard of, like Sony or Toyota, or so there are these big names which have sort of are badges which have sort of taken the Korean name around the world. The other is, of course, the media. So the dramas, the pop, the boy bands, the dances, the spectacular, very very highly produced side of media output. So in that to me is it's Korea's projecting itself in different ways. But in which areas would you say Korea leads well? It's like getting it right, and it's being recognized for it, and it's also in a global market, sort of finding its place for ideas, for culture, etc. And I'd like you to do this 2 minutes to 3 minutes.
Okay. Well, I think Brendan has already mentioned one of the areas. That's development through education. And education considered broadly to include R&D. There's strong empirical data over decades, literally, now, that shows Korea, along with Israel and a few other countries, and Japan, led the world in R&D, research and development. And this is something that Dr. O and the other US-trained technocrats who were leaders in this movement have stressed. So development through education. Over the years also, there's a tradition in East Asia here of mass campaigns. And Korea undertook campaigns to train citizens. It didn't just build networks and network infrastructure, but it made these broad and long-term outreach efforts to educate large numbers, like millions of Korean citizens, in how to use these new services. But I think it's important, the origins of this in the 1980s. I briefly mentioned the political and economic turmoil after the assassination of President Park Chung-hee. In the midst of that turmoil, you had a military government, but a military government where Chun Doo-hwan, the leader, appreciated the technology, and he was advised on economics by Kim Jae-ik, the very top senior leader advisor to the president. And so in the 1980s, all these critical developments took place. The capacity to manufacture electronic switches. Korea was only the 10th country in the world to be able to do that. And that is important because of the cumulative nature of technology development. If you follow that line through to today, the export of networks and network equipment is a big part of Korea's success. The 1980s successes gave them confidence so that in 1993, I recall interviewing the president of ETRI, the Electronics and Telecommunications Research Institute in Daejeon, the so-called Bell Labs of Korea. And he told me in 1993, he said, Professor Larson, we are going to adopt CDMA as our mobile standard. Well, Korea did, and in the 1990s, they became the first country to introduce code division multiple access, CDMA-based mobile telephony. So everyone in Korea by the end of the 1990s was carrying around CDMA-based mobile phones.
Okay, so this is part of a revolution that saw Korea develop very quickly, and its communications industry develop very quickly, and then R&D, education, and communication sort of came in. So and it leads well in that now. Brendan, can you pick up from that?
Yeah, I think when we're talking about leading well, there are two considerations. One is efficiently, and that's what we just heard. The second, when we're talking about leading well, it's a more normative consideration, a value-based consideration. In what ways does Korea act in a way that should be emulated or could be emulated by others? And of course, first of all, they've done all this while being a conflict-affected society, still technically at war with North Korea. And yet this hasn't stopped them from the double miracle on the Han River, the economic progress and the political progress. Secondly, I think when we look at the role of the citizens in Korea, it's incredibly important that citizenry, not only that they've all been educated, and Korea spends more on education than any other country in the world, but also that there's this social awareness, this idea of contribution in Korea that has led Korea to have the second largest overseas volunteer program in the world, second only to the US Peace Corps. World Friends Korea sends a lot of young people out into the world to help. But also domestically, when we saw the devastating impact of COVID-19, Korea dealt with that extremely well. And partly that was because of the government response, but more the case of the people being willing to contribute to overcoming this devastating pandemic. So Korea does very well, not only in terms of efficiency and leadership, but also normative leadership. And of course, it doesn't have any of the imperial or neo-imperial baggage of other potential leaders in the region or in the world. Unfortunately, I think there's a tendency to focus on the Korean wave of cultural diplomacy. It's a soft power juggernaut, ranked number 2 in the world also for soft power after Germany. And there's a tendency to focus on this technological efficiency. But what we need more of is to understand why Korean society does some things very well that should be emulated, but also things that they don't do very well.
Right. And that's going to lead on to our third question in terms of what challenges is Korea facing that may jeopardize its leadership position. So we've heard that education is incredibly important. That a large value is placed on education, and we've seen that an enormous amount of research money has poured in to sort of build these institutions into the position that they now occupy, which is as respected and I'd say within this region, sort of universities which are doing very, very well. But here's the negatives then. What may jeopardize its leadership position? Where's Korea not doing well or slipping? And let's start with education.
Okay, well, education has been called, and I agree, the fundamental process of the information age. I mean, we're living in an era now. We'll talk a little bit more later before the panel ends about artificial intelligence, generative artificial, and the new. But one of the major lessons that Korea holds for many other countries, I think, is that it succeeded in fueling economic development by doing things smartly, if you will, through R&D, education of citizens. And also, I used to follow, when I was at Fulbright, I followed study abroad. Professor Howe mentioned some of this earlier, but for many years, in absolute numbers, Korea sent more students to the United States for study abroad than any other country. Now, China and India, I think, are number one, number two.
But they're far larger countries.
Yeah, on a per capita basis, Korea is still far and away number one in the world in terms of.
And Jim, do they come back to Korea? Because that's
well,
is it a brain drain?
It used to be a brain drain, but I think a longitudinal analysis going back to the mid-20th century, looking to the present, would show there was a turning point when it actually became attractive for Koreans to study abroad and then come back to the US. And so in the 1980s, this long-term plan to foster the electronics sector that was drafted by technocrats, led by Oh Myung and with the backing of Kim Jae-ik and the Blue House. That was, it was US trained PhDs who really led that effort. Not all of them were US trained, but some were bright young Korean researchers as well. So when Dr. Oh and I had to finalize the final chapter for the book, and he is the principal author of this, there was very little debate, but that education, broadly conceived to include a number of different things, as we've talked about here, is the principal success factor, followed by others.
Okay, yeah. Brendan, you can pick up on education. So
yeah,
but I want the negative slant.
Negative slant, of course. As Dean of the Graduate School of International Studies at URI, there are no negatives.
Of course.
But of course there are. There are some major problems. And one is, despite encouraging a huge number of international students to come to Korea, they're not terribly well looked after when they get here. That they face a lot of challenges in their universities, but also in broader society. And that is a challenge, a hurdle that they're going to have to overcome to maintain this influx. Also, a lot of international students, they're attracted to study in Korea because they want to stay in Korea. But Korea makes it very difficult for them to stay. So these are the things that need to be thought about more. In addition, for Korean students, of course, we have a demographic time bomb in this country. We've got the lowest birth rate in the world, well, except for Vatican City. So second to Vatican City in terms of birth rate, which means that the population is shrinking, but in particular, the population of young people is shrinking. And a lot of universities in this country are facing this challenge that they're not getting enough students to survive. Well, how do we fix that? Well, one way is, of course, attract more international students, but also you need to do something to address the shortcomings in society of a shrinking society, which means Korea needs to be much more open in terms of immigration, because without immigration, Korea is going to face some very serious challenges of a lopsided population with a very large older population and a very small younger population earning the wages to pay the taxes to keep the older generation in their pensions.
If I may, I want to add one thing on the negative side, because when I began working with Oh Myung, Dr. O said to me, I vividly remember this. He said, "Now, Dr. Larson, let's not focus only on the successes, but let's take a look at the failures." And one of them that stands out, actually a conclusion of our research, if you take a look at our book, Digital Development in Korea, the second edition of it, one of the failures was called smartphone shock. The iPhone was introduced in 2007, June of 2007 in the United States. I think more than 80 other countries had adopted it before Korea did 2.5 years later. Why was the arrival of the iPhone in Korea delayed by 2.5 years? There were 3 reasons. The mobile service providers already saw that young people were purchasing iPods and installing Skype. So the mobile service providers, SK Telecom, KT, they were afraid of losing their voice revenue. I have this on authority from top executives at SKT and others. The second is that the handset manufacturers, as I said earlier, they were manufacturing CDMA-based feature phones and very happy doing that, but they didn't understand what this iPhone was, because actually the iPhone is not the hardware, it's the apps ecosystem. That's the real revolutionary impact of the iPhone. So that was up in the air. And finally, the government had this WIPI standard that they hoped would become an international standard, but it failed. Wireless Internet Protocol for Interoperability.
So
Standard setting entered in, and
okay. So this is an example of the same things that had made Korea successful in the close relationship between business and government. And I think this is similar to Japan in that the models that were copied or attempted to sort of be copied in terms of, this is great, we have companies working very, very closely with the government, that when something came from the outside, it was essentially blocked. So there's anti-competition there.
that's right. And
Okay, so
And I think also that this is a byproduct of the negative impact of Korean nationalism as well. And this is why there's opposition to immigration. This is why they don't let students stay after they finish their studies. But also, this is why they insist, most universities and indeed all levels of government, they insist on using their own Office package instead of using Microsoft Office. So if you go to even the public diplomacy aspect of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you try to download material from there, you'll find that it's all in Hangul word, even if it's written in English. They use a software program that is only used in Korea. And so it's not very good at outreach. And this is because it's supporting the Korean industry, but also it's, well, we want a specifically Korean thing here. I mean, I think it's probably the only country that has a national holiday for its alphabet. So,
Well, and that is worth adding one of the alphabet, that is Hangul. There's an ITU study that was published in 2003 and has been widely circulated on the internet called Broadband Korea, an Internet Case Study. And in chapter 1 of that study, there's an egregious error. They state, these international authors state that the Korean alphabet, which is called Hangul, is pictographic and not well suited to computerization. That's a gross mischaracterization of Hangul. There's a holiday because King Sejong, Hangul at one point was in a poll of professors. It was voted as the #1 cultural heritage here in Korea. And in fact, it's phonetic and alphabetic, not pictographic. And you can learn it quickly, but it's also well suited to keying in and so forth. So,
well, and this that's a very good in sort of lead in. I think it's tomorrow. There's a visit to the National Writing Museum, which is just close by. So that links in well to that plug. Okay, we've got about 15 minutes left. So if you have any questions for the panel, there's a microphone that will circulate. Is there anyone here who has a question for either of the panelists? If not, then I will. If you have a question, any questions? Oh, over there, man in the blue shirt. Please wait for the microphone so that you can be heard online.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jimmy from Western Carolina University and in North Carolina, USA. So how are these negatives brought to the education ministry? Are they communicated? Are they working directly together to solve these issues?
Yeah, okay, that's a very good question.
And I think a very important question, because Korean Ministry of Education tends to micromanage education in Korea. That we have a lot less autonomy as universities and departments than is probably the case in other countries. If we want to set up a new program, we have to get clearance from the Ministry of Education. So certainly these things do need to be pointed out to the Ministry of Education, and they do have a consultancy board. One of our faculty at IWA GSIS has just been selected to join that board to advise them what they need to do differently. So hopefully that will impact in the coming years. But certainly you're absolutely right. The Ministry of Education needs to step up and address these issues. But historically, they've been quite good at addressing what needs to change in Korean education to fit the needs of Korean society. I mentioned earlier that when I first started here, foreign professors had to teach 3 courses per semester, whereas Koreans taught 2 courses, and Korean professors were paid more than foreign professors for doing less work. That clearly had to change. And as a result of input from my dean and associate dean at that time, the associate dean from then is now the president of IWA, they lobbied to change this policy, saying, well, how does this make sense? And first of all at IWA, and then the other universities followed that now foreign faculty can be appointed on Korean contracts. But yeah, this is the next step.
If I could just add a couple of points. One is I enjoyed teaching at KAIST for 1.5 years before coming to SUNY Korea. But KAIST is an exception to the situation for most Korean universities who report through the Ministry of Education to the government. KAIST is on a totally separate track, and they report. So one of the interesting things about that is there is draft beer on tap in the faculty center at KAIST, which but it's a broader. The Institute for Basic Science and the various activities at KAIST are funded and sort of controlled by the Korean government directly at the top level. And then a second point, I spent 3 years over the last 3 years as Vice President for Academic Affairs, Provost at SUNY Korea. And SUNY Korea was formed in a sort of lengthy negotiated agreement between Stony Brook University and the SUNY system and SUNY Korea. It is a limited liability corporation here, and that is an ongoing process. I think those of you who may have attended the panel yesterday learned maybe more details about this, but it's a negotiated thing, and as Professor Howe mentioned, there are ongoing debates because of for almost all Korean universities. The Ministry of Education is very, very powerful. This is unlike the situation in the US, for example, where the Department of Education at the federal level is relatively weak compared to the state level, where most of the power resides.
Thank you. Any other questions? This lady here.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Yuli Wang. I'm from Taiwan, and I'm quite inspired by Dr. Howie about the nationalism development by Korean society, because we took like 3 hours to come here yesterday by train. It's quite unfriendly because we can't use Google here. That's what you say. They develop the different kind of system here, and so in this kind of from this kind of this point of view, how do you see the method that Korean society choose? The differences between Korean society system compared to China. They also use their own system to create industries, to protect their own industries. And I was wondering, what's your point of view of that? And secondly, I had visited EUR campus, quite beautiful campus. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So, Jim, perhaps you can take this.
Or it was addressed to
I
me.
think it was
sorry.
addressed
Is
to
it you?
Brendan. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
Brendan.
No, absolutely. Of course, China has an extremely large internal market, so they can survive going their own way. Korea can't. So Korea is going to have to internationalize further. At some point, they're going to have to bite the bullet and say, okay, if this is the international standard, we're going to have to adopt the international standard. They're being very successful, of course, with their own operating systems. All the Samsung phones, of course, use Android, and Android is being used in other phones in other countries as well. But when it comes to these other issues, yes, we use Naver maps here because Google Maps won't work. These, I think, are some of the things that need to be addressed, and we need to tackle the nationalism head on. Point out that it's not in Korea's national interest any longer to be so protectionist. And we also see it in terms of supermarkets. It's very difficult for international supermarket chains to come into Korea. And when they do come in, they have to be a partner with a Korean company, and quite often they fail. So there were a large number of, which is the British supermarket, Tesco. But Tesco pulled out of Korea because they just got fed up with dealing with Korean bureaucracy. So they do need to make things easier. Korea does not rank very highly in terms of ease of business, doing business in Korea. There are lots of complaints about that, persistent complaints. But Korea also does eventually react to international criticism. One example would be when The Economist ran an article saying that North Korean beer is better than South Korean beer. Traumatizing to the Koreans. But they reacted by changing the legislation to allow small craft breweries to develop in South Korea. And now craft beer in South Korea is better than North Korean beer. So they're happy now. So international criticism does have an impact. They're very sensitive to it. They get very prickly about it. But then they think, well, okay, we need to address this then. So another example was when Seoul was criticized as being one of the most unattractive places for expatriates to live. They had a huge campaign of beautifying Seoul, tree planting, uncovering and cleaning up a stream that runs through the center of Seoul, all these things because of international criticism. They get very sensitive first. The initial reaction is to push back against it and defend their national honor, but then they change.
Thanks, Brendan. Jim, do you have anything to
Well,
add to
just the final question that you had provided to us about looking to the future, I just want to put a pitch in here that artificial intelligence, generative AI, but also robotics. Korea has the highest, by far, density of industrial robots in the world, far exceeding that of Japan and other countries. Why? It's because of the automotive industry and the electronics industry now. The industries that were built up over the past several decades. And there's a wealth of information available about this. And in terms of empirical data, the book that I had the privilege of writing with Dr. Oh, we agreed that there would always be a need for periodic updating. So the second edition came out in 2020, but the whole boom of discussion about artificial intelligence and generative AI and how it's going to influence the future, the energy requirements for that technology, and so on and so forth. There was recently, in August, September, a scandal here on sexually explicit deepfakes on Telegram. And so Korea is in a difficult challenge looking ahead to the future about the development of apps that make sense in the Korean language, because the corpus that you feed in to train generative AI has a lot to do with whether and how it's going to hallucinate possibly in the future. So there are a lot of challenges, but I would not bet against Korea. Let's put it that way. Based on their track record, I'm an optimist.
You're a Korean optimist. Okay,
Yeah.
very good. Brendan, are you a Korea optimist? Would you be, because there's the demographic sort of challenge, which a lot of countries are facing.
Yeah.
China went off the demographic cliff. Japan went off the demographic cliff. Japan, I think 2010, something like that. China at some point during the coronavirus pandemic. So it's not unique to Korea. But are you a career optimist?
Yes and no. In fact, this is not the only social challenge. We also have the challenge of the world's higher suicide rate. That there are, especially young people, there are some deeply unhappy young people, and that needs to be addressed. There we have a lot of people, lonely people, living and dying in isolation, and that needs to be addressed. But again, they are addressing it. They've just set up a large fund to address the phenomenon of lonely people living and dying alone. And there is an awareness of the need to change societal attitudes towards hyper competition. This fear of failure and the idea that if you're a failure by these unbelievably high standards that are set in Korean society, then you should remove yourself from that society. These are attitudes that need to change, but I think that Korean society is very resilient, that it has shown a willingness to change and adapt, but also I think that Korean society is inherently a caring society, which again seems strange. It's painted as this, neo-Confucian society where everything's about service, but no, I think they're inherently caring, and that's where the hope for the future lies. And we see this, the innovations, in the social innovations in Korea, the mass demonstrations to support the most vulnerable, to support democracy, but also my own institution. IAFOR is nearly 140 years old now, which makes it one of the oldest establishments for educating women, certainly in this region, but even in the world. There were not that many institutions set up before IAFOR to educate women at a tertiary level.
But
you have 20 seconds.
Korean reunification. I do not believe that Korea will ever forever remain divided. It's a culture that is just as much present north of the DMZ as south, and at some point this issue will need to be addressed.
And that is an excellent place to finish. Thank you very much, Professor Larson. Thank you very much, Professor Howe. I've found this very, very interesting, and already I think I've got a number of things I want to read more about, find out more on this wonderful country. Thank you very much for being here, and please join me in thanking you.